for me? Test. 1, 2. Well, it's going to take 30 seconds. Test, 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 test. Testing 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. You can mute again.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. One of the things that there's a little bit of a change. Last time, for those of us who are here, I said we'd essentially conclude this series with a look at texts from the book of Judges. And the book of Judges, in a way, not quite like the book of Leviticus. It's not likely to be the place where you curl up at home with a beverage and read for fun. There's some difficult text in Judges, and we'll get to that. But Pastor Dave and I had spoken about, and it was my miscalculation, that I would work through the season of Lent with a title that From Ashes to Palms, where I will look at these Lenten texts, most of which, not all of which, but most of which you're likely to hear starting this Ash Wednesday. And so I'll begin there and work through these. And then we may or may not return to Judges, but at least for now, these will be the Lenten text. So the text that we will look at today are those that you're likely hear on Wednesday and next Sunday. All right? So in a way, it might, I hope, prepare us for some of what we may hear. It is not surprising to you that even today's text, which has to do with transfiguration and has to do with three of the disciples, on the mountaintop, and presumably, if you're there, maybe it's a great view, and you're sitting up there and you're thinking, this is nice. And if it's okay with you, can we just build in the text, in the original, it says, essentially, build 3 booths, build 3 tents, and stick around up here. And of course, Jesus, being, Jesus, says very succinctly, no. We're going back. And it is interesting, in part, because the work that must happen doesn't really happen on the mountain. It gives you a glimpse, if you will, of maybe, as Moses says, into the promised land. And remember, Moses ended up in the promised land? Trick question? Of course, he doesn't, right? He doesn't. He has a glimpse of it, but he never gets the chance to enter. The fact that he doesn't get the chance to enter doesn't mean that the word should not come back. Okay? Again, much more contemporary, of course, we remember the last major speech of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, I know that I Have a Dream gets a great deal of the press, right, and publicity, but it might actually help us to think of that speech the night before his assassination, where he was in Memphis, Tennessee, where he talks about, guess what? I have been to the mountaintop, and I have seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but I want to let you know. And almost prophetically says what? I am not afraid to die. Okay? Almost eerily prophetic. And of course, the next day, as you know, right? So being on the mountaintop, of course, important, but as Jesus has said, you can't just go there and remain there. It's messy. And so sometimes, one other quick connection with that, sometimes, despite what we might think of our friend Sisyphus, who has become known as what? We are left with a task that is what? Sisyphean, that is never ending. I'll never get it done. Because, of course, our friend Sisyphus went up and down, up and down. But Albert Camus, the great Albert Camus, once says, maybe even Sisyphus, the journey up and down the mountain is something that is noble. So get even the capacity to climb up there, but knowing that you can't remain there would be important. So I want for us to begin, some of you have asked about stuff that I've written, which as you know, I don't speak about, because you could find those kinds of things elsewhere. But one of my last book, which is this, that is called Take Heart, From Despair to Hope in Turbulent Times, I should tell you, is much more of a theopolitical commentary. And so you would want to read that with care. Okay? But in there, I will tell you what it's not. Okay? It is not 5 easy steps to become anything. Okay? Okay? Any book that has the 5 easy steps, hang on to your money and go elsewhere. All right? There are almost never 5 easy steps to anything. Let me rephrase that. There are almost never 5 easy steps to anything that matters. Okay? Probably have 5 easy steps to stuff that do not matter. So, but this really, I wrote this in the context of some of what was happening 6, 7 years ago. And the idea that it is not the last word. Sometimes it feels like the last word, but it is not the last word. Keep in mind that even the best among us, not to speak of the least, okay, is always going to be penultimate. It's not the last word. And so, at least here, the book looks at, some ancient text, both biblical, but also a sort of literary text, but also contemporary text, fairly contemporary text. One of which, I don't know if most of us, maybe all of us, have read Henrik Ibsen's works. Okay, I know it's now something that leaps off the page for us to read, but there is something there. All right, there is something there. And Henrik Ibsen has something to tell us as we read titles such as Enemy of the State. Okay, that's not a make-up title, that's an actual title of one of his books. So it deals with some of that, and what can we see, if you will. So if that is of interest to you, it's there. I have this up here that says, to hope actually for us, for those of us who have a foundation, if you will, in terms of a belief system. Hope is an act of defiance. Hope, I believe, tells us that we do not have to simply sustain a status quo. We do not have to embrace it and imagine that this is the way it's always going to be. Hope is a challenge in the face of what seems at times to be insurmountable, which at times seems to be almost impossible to imagine tomorrow. And yet hope propels us to imagine that there is a tomorrow. And it might not come actually tomorrow, but there is a tomorrow. And that in fact, despair is not the last word. Now, I want to be careful. Some of us, maybe all of us, I don't know, if you have ever visited, let's say, a concentration camp, Auschwitz, or Dachau, or Treblinka, or Majdanek, which you don't hear about as much. It's even today, if you stand in those places and you read a statement such as despair is not the last word, and try to imagine in that moment 80 years ago, you can begin, I think, to imagine where despair was the last word, where in fact that was it. How do you get out of this place? Where cruelty, in many respects, was meant to be the last word. So it was not even I'll give you an example. I was at Auschwitz and we were studying the Holocaust, and I walked in, remember, work will set you free. That's how it opens up the gate. And in there, I will tell you, if you wanted to restart the camp next week, it's ready to go. That's how those buildings look. It is absolutely staggering how they're built. But one of the things that struck me in walking in there was one of the areas where Joseph Mengele did his experiments. And in there was a small room. And in that room, within the building, was a room that was meant to even punish you beyond. It was meant to kill you ultimately. And so I walked into this room, and it's really only about 6 feet by 6 feet. That's it. And it's about 8 feet high, thereabouts. So it's very enclosed, with one little window about 7 feet on the door. And in that room, prisoners were sometimes put, and there was water that came from the top. Drip after drip after drip. And of course, you stand there and ultimately you drown. So this was not just a camp that was a concentration camp. There was also within that different levels of cruelty and punishment. And so sometimes it's very difficult. And yet for those of us who have a foundation that says there is hope, that what we envision is not always, what we envision in front of us is not always the last word. We have to believe there is something beyond that. But in the moment, it's difficult. And that's it. In the moment, it's difficult. From ashes to Psalms. And as you know by now, the fact that you're still here with me should remind you that sometimes we delve a little bit into language. And so if I said to you, and not a trick question, I know you think all of my questions are trick questions. Not today. No, let me rephrase that. Not in this moment. It might be in 10 minutes. Because Lent means what? Slow is what it means. It's where we get, we have other Romance languages that are predicated on the Latin, and it means slow. And perhaps there is a reason for us as we begin Lent in a few days to do what? Slow down. Now, if most of your speed is in first gear or stop, right? This doesn't matter because you're already there. But most of us are not in first gear or stop. We are constantly, I'm speaking to myself here, okay? We're constantly on this rapid, right? We even have in our culture, not new, fast food. Okay? No, seriously, this is what we do. This is who we are. Multitasking is a thing. It's not even a part, our grandparents would not have that as part of our vocabulary, right? But here we are, Lent. And Lent is a time, if you will, to slow down. By the way, not to stop, but to slow down. You're still moving, if you will, but to stop, but to slow down. So I want to begin, and I don't know how much we'll get through here, but I want to begin with the book of Joel. And it's one of these really quirky things. When we have lectionary text, right? We go through a cycle. Primarily, let's say with the Gospels, we go through a cycle where we're really looking at the 3 synoptic Gospels. John gets in there regularly, but primarily the 3 synoptic Gospels. Okay? And synoptic, of course, as you well know, meaning literally seeing alike, right? Much of it is seeing alike. And then, of course, we have the Old Testament texts typically are chosen to relate to the gospel. I think it's a hit and miss half of the time. Today, by the way, is a good example when it hits, right? Both with Moses and the Transfiguration. But Joel is one of those that shows up every Ash Wednesday, regardless of where we are in the lectionary cycle. It shows up every Ash Wednesday. It's the Old Testament text for Ash Wednesday. And what we think is that Joel was likely written about 100, 150 years after the exile. Now, we will look at this text in a second. You and I are much more familiar with this sort of, not anti-war, but texts that challenge to take our weapons and do what? Beat them into plowshares, right? Beat them into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks, right? We're familiar with that from the prophet Isaiah. And of course, the prophet Isaiah, in that particular section of the prophet Isaiah, is pre-exilic, as we would say, all right? Likely in the middle of the 8th century. Now, when we read this, we realize that, to sort of paraphrase Ecclesiastes, there's a time and a season. Okay? There are parts of that text that I personally don't like, but last time I checked, they didn't ask me whether I liked it or not. Okay? I don't like, there's a season to hate, for example. Okay? But again, there it is. But in there, right, there is a season, there's a season, there's a season. Here, in a way, this is a season. All right, Joel says the season has come. And what I'm about to say is going to be from generation. This is not part of the text. They skip out this verse here. But it's from generation to generation. I put it up there because the word that we're about to hear is not just for us. It's not just for our children. It's for our children's children and those who come after them. In other words, spread the word, which means that when we seek X or Y for our lives, we should do so knowing that it's for those who come after us, for our children and our grandchildren and our children and our children and our children after that. So, Ash Wednesday, therefore, particularly with the Joel text, is for generations to come. Now, it begins, and I will read this, all right? Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near. Now, if I tell you something is near, what's the impression that you have? Soon, right? Soon. Well, you can pause, all right? Because we don't know what that means. Why? Remember last time we checked, Jesus was coming back when? Soon. Okay? How is that working out? Okay? So Jesus was coming back soon. And by the way, the people believed soon as we would think of soon. Why? Because what's the earliest that we think, okay? What's the earliest gospel that we believe was written? Mark. Okay, Mark. And Mark, by any measure from scholars who are New Testament scholars and well established, okay, will tell you across the board that probably at the very minimum was a generation after the time of Jesus. So what happened in between? Jesus was coming back soon. If Jesus is coming back soon, do you really want me to go start writing? No. That's not going to be my primary sort of impetus at that moment. And when, of course, a week, a day, a week, a month, a year goes by, and you realize, you know what? This is going to go on. What do we need to do? Right. Have the word out there. And of course, we see that, and we can see where Matthew follows Mark. And we can see where Luke follows Okay, and we can see it gets longer and longer, and the focus is somewhat different. But it says here, it's coming soon. And because we don't know what soon is tomorrow or in the next generation, it absolutely propels us to do what? Prepare, prepare, prepare. And the day of the Lord, and we talked about this, those of us who were, I think it might have been last fall, in fact, we were looking at the 8th century prophets, and we were looking at Amos. And Amos, a couple of centuries before Joel, talks about the day of the Lord. And he says, the day of the Lord is coming. And the day of the Lord will not be one of celebration. It will be one of darkness. It will be one of gloom. And for those of you who want to run away, right? Let me put it this way. You can run, but you can't hide. Okay? It's like running away from a bear and finding yourself in facing a lion. And finally you get what you consider into a safe house, and you're panting and you're breathing heavily, and you lean against the wall only to find that there is what? A poisonous snake waiting for you right there. Okay? It is not, by the way, this is not, I'm not making up an imagery here. It's what the text says. But the people imagined that the day of the Lord was always going to be God bringing victory to them in some way, whether it's in war or whether in fact it is in the sort of the harvesting time. But Amos says, you can't expect the day of the Lord to continue like this when in fact you are not doing what you need to do, which is what? That particular text in Amos ends with this crescendo of a verse that all of us know because it's been used 1,000,000 times over. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. You want what God promised? Here's what you have to do. So when Joel is saying the day of the Lord is coming, by the way, don't jump up and down thinking that this is a moment to celebrate. This is going to be dark. Like blackness spread among the mountains, a great and powerful army comes. Okay. Yet even now, says the Lord, return to me with all your heart. With all your heart. It sounds a little odd. Have I been doing this with only kind of sort of my heart? Okay. A part of return to me fully. What does that mean? And what we do know is that, of course, again, the Hebrew word that is used here it's pronounced shuv. That's the Hebrew word. And I can tell from your face, you're all saying, oh, now it makes sense. Okay? It's pronounced shuv. It literally means return or turn around, but it is most often, this is an exception, there are a few of them, it's most often translated repent. Okay? So repentance in the tradition, the Hebrew tradition, in the Greek tradition, certainly in the Christian tradition, literally means to do what? Turn around. By the way, you're not taking a 45-degree exit into some place. Okay? This is a turnaround. So when it says return to me, it is referring to doing what? A time to repent, a time to fully turn around. Why? But here's what you need to do. You have to do it with fasting. You have to do it with weeping. You have to do it with mourning. You have to rent your hearts. Don't run around tearing your clothes saying, oh, woe is me. You want to repent and to change, to turn around, to make a U-turn. Rip your heart. And who will see that? God. Okay? Your neighbor is not going to see it. Your friends are not going to see it. Your family are not going to see it. Okay? That is because it's internal. If you really want to do this, then change. And remember in Isaiah chapter 58, in verses 6 and 7, this might not ring a bell, but in verses 6 and 7 of Isaiah chapter 58, which is a post-exilic text, he says, when you fast, right? When you fast, you must do so for what reason? You must do so because you're pursuing justice, because you're pursuing righteousness, because you're tending to the oppressed, because you're trying to set free those who are sort of in captivity. In other words, you don't fast simply for the sake of fasting. You don't fast simply to say, well, I have fasted, and I'm walking around drooping, and then Greg says to me, you're not looking well here, Hemchan. And then I get to say to you, well, I'm fasting. Okay? At which point, I have gotten my reward. That's it. Okay? So if that's all you're looking for your friends and neighbors to sort of give you a kind of, boy, that Hemchan is really fasting. If that's all I'm seeking, knock myself out. The text says, don't do that. Okay? Don't do that. If you're looking for kind of if you're looking for the public to massage your ego, thankfully we don't have anyone in our society who seeks that. Okay? Every now and again, my internal voice gets spoken. If that's all you want, okay, knock yourself out. But if you really want to turn around, if you really want to change, what must you do? It has to come from the heart. It has to come from within. That's really what it is. Now, I have said this before, and given the context here, every Sunday, of course, as you know, we affirm our faith. There are exceptions, like I think on Easter we'll probably use the Nicene Creed, but typically we use what? The Apostles' Creed, okay? And it begins how? I believe, okay? The Nicene Creed begins how, by the way? We believe. It's a much more sort of community creed that comes out of the Council of Nicaea. I believe. But here's the thing about I believe. There's a reason it's called the creed. Because the Latin there is credo. Okay? All of us have creeds, by the way, not just the affirmation creed that we repeat in the context of the liturgy. We all have creeds. And most of them, maybe for most of us, our creeds are not written. But we have those principles within us. Because we do what? This is what we believe. This is what we believe. Right? Right. But the word means what? Heart. That's the Latin root of the word. It has come to be translated, I believe, because the assumption is that if I say I believe you or I believe in you, it should come from where? The heart. And those of us in this room, I feel I can say this now, sort of without fear of contradiction, who used to write letters. I don't mean like text on our phone. I mean letters, like ink and paper. I know it sounds so quaint. Often, depending who we're writing to, sometimes we sign off what? Yours truly. Or love, not if you're applying for a job, but sure. Sincerely, and sometimes cordially. which means from my heart. Literally is what the word means. Okay? And that's where we get the word cardiac from as well. So when we talk about renting your heart, it has to do with that one place that goes beyond everything that is external. It has to come with the one place that God could see and that you would know. And why would you do this? Return to the Lord your God, for He is... I will... Okay? Because this... I'll go back to those slides in a second. Because this is a God of grace and a God of mercy and a God of steadfast love. Slow to anger. But the presupposition is that God could be angry. Okay? This is slow to anger. Okay? Because the presupposition is that maybe there is even redemptive value in anger. When you and I see injustice, you should not walk away and simply say, well, you know, I guess I'm heading to lunch. It should feel a sense of anger within you, which is not hatred, but anger, which should also be something that propels you to say or do something. But this is a God who is slow to anger. This is not a God who goes from 0 to 60 and leaps off tall buildings, you know, into... This is... I'm a God of grace and mercy and steadfast love. Come back to me. Come back to me. Return to me. And relents from punishing. Who knows whether He will turn and relent? By the way, that He there, who is it referring to? It's us, right? Though it's somewhat ambiguous because it was just speaking about God. But it's not capitalized. But of course we're translating it. I know you want to capitalize there. And leave a blessing behind Him. Okay. So what do you need to do? Blow the trumpet in Zion. Sanctify a feast. Sanctify, of course, meaning what? Holy, right? Sanctus, sanctus, sanctus. Sanctify a feast. Call a solemn assembly. Gather the people. Sanctify the congregation, the whole gathering. Assemble, and here is the deal. Assemble the aged. Gather the children. Even the infants who are breastfeeding. Let the bridegroom leave his room, the bride her canopy. Between the vestibule and the altar, let the priests, the ministers, let them weep. And let them pray, spare your people, O Lord, do not make your heritage a mockery. And I always love this. What would it say? What should it be said among the peoples? Where is your God? Because the fear is that if you continue like this, right? When Moses was on the mountain, remember that little scenario? And God left Aaron in charge. Moses left Aaron in charge. And while Moses is on the mountain, the people are saying to Aaron, can we have a little, can we do a little building of a golden calf here? And Aaron says what? Sure. Yeah, seems like a good idea. Okay. And of course, God is looking down. Moses could see, and God says to Moses, see what your people are doing. And Moses says to God, they're not my people, they're your people. But don't you love this exchange? It's reminiscent of Sarah and God. God said to Sarah, why are you laughing? And Sarah says, I am laughing. And God says, yes, you were laughing. Sarah said, no, I wasn't laughing. I mean, you love this exchange. And Moses says to God, they're your people. And God says, okay then, I'm going to destroy them. And Moses says, hang on. Think of what the neighbors are going to say. I mean, that's the exchange. So, you know, I know your immediate impulse is to wipe them out, but you got to think of the neighbors. I mean, here it says, you know, we don't want the neighbors to saying, what kind of a God do you have here? Okay? And so this is what you need to do. Why? Go back here for a second. Okay, when Lent begins, this is what we'll hear, right? Remember, it's really, if pause for a second, think of being told in that moment that you're dust. You're dust. And to dust you will return. And where is that coming from? Genesis. Remember, you are dust. You're not infinite. You're not permanent. You came from the ground. Right? For all, not for us in here because we're enlightened, but for folks, particularly folks who would think, well, the woman came from the rib of the man. You've heard this many times, right? And therefore, what? Somehow you extrapolate to conclude that the male is superior, right? Let me help you out here. You don't believe that, right, Doris? Doris looks at Pastor Ted and says, we don't believe that, do we? Let's be very clear. I don't think running around saying, well, you came from my rib, is anything to boast about, knowing that you came from dirt. So, I mean, you're dust. You're dust here. Okay. So before you get overly, excited about this, right? But the thing about this, remember you are dust, and to dust you return. We are told that the human being is formed from dust. By the way, so this idea has been generated, if you will, biblically speaking, over time. Okay, and those of us in this day and age now, as we begin Ash Wednesday, remind ourselves as we begin this season. And God knows our frame. God knows our frame. What is interesting, the Hebrew there, by the way, is exactly the same word as formed. Okay, it's the Hebrew word yatsar. It means frame. It's rarely used as a verb. But here, formed and frame are actually the same Hebrew word. The God who formed us is familiar with who we are, with our frame. As this season begins, it's a reminder of the nature of who we are, and that it is something for us to remember. Okay, now, so remember where we came from. Okay, and I want to say that this is a whole, by the way, we can spend weeks just on these two statements, but let me spend 2 minutes on it. Okay, where have we come from? Did God bring creation, as we see in the Latin up there, creatio ex nihilo? Did creation come from nothing, right? Nihilo, we know nihilo, of course, we get our English word what? Yeah, as in nihilism, and maybe even more common, annihilate, same root. Did God bring creation out of nothing? That's been common. Thank you, European scholars. Okay? That's been the common way to think about it. Except when you read the text. What was there before? Darkness. Which, by the way, whether or not you like darkness, it's still a thing. Okay? Which we need. Or is it order from chaos? Did God bring order to the universe when it was chaotic? Okay, again, much more common idea these days among scholars, that in fact God ordered the universe, created, of course, by ordering the universe. And so remember, that's what the text says, remember where you have come from. Remember the birthing that God gave to you. Whether it is from nothing, or whether God formed you out of the chaotic life of the universe. And then we get to Psalm 51, that magnificent penitential psalm, which again is one of the Psalms, is one of the texts that we will hear on Ash Wednesday. Have mercy on me, O Lord, according to your steadfast love, according to your mercy, even in the midst of all of my transgressions. Again, we should not be surprised that love, steadfast love, chesed, mercy, which, by the way, quite often in these texts, mercy is a translation of a Hebrew word that is pronounced racham, which might not ring a bell, but it's the word that is sometimes also translated compassion. And it is the word in Hebrew that means, the root of the word also means womb. It also means womb. And so we have this idea, almost bring upon us, O Lord, create in me a clean heart, and bring your, almost, one might say, motherly love and compassion onto me, if you will. It's a magnificent imagery. For I know my transgressions, and that's important. Why? It's one thing for me to say, oh Lord, you know my transgressions. Well, yes, of course, Lord, you know my transgressions. But in order for me to turn around, what's important? I have to acknowledge this. And I know my transgressions. And then it continues in that beautiful psalm. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a right spirit within me. So let me pause. Not a trick question. What does it mean to have a right spirit? I mean, we read this, we sing this, we chant it, and I'm saying, in the spirit of Lent, let's slow down. What does it mean to have a right spirit? We know what spirit is. The word spirit here is ruach, that means spirit, or wind, or breath, and it is the same parallel in Greek, which of course is the word that we're much more familiar with. It's pronounced pneuma, which gives us our word pneumonia. Okay? In Greek, the P is pronounced. In English, of course, it's silent. And it has to do, of course, with what? Breath, right? So, create in me a clean heart. And renew a right spirit. What's the right spirit? By the way, again, just to sort of emphasize, the word that is used here actually, and it's always an interesting, I had to go back and look at this because I thought, is this righteous? Which sounds like it. But actually the word is for steadfast love. Create in me a spirit of steadfast love. That's the word that is used here, if you will. And then it says, put a right spirit within me, and sustain me with a willing spirit. And here's what I want to emphasize. Sustain me with a willing spirit. Again, what does that mean? When you hear this, as you will on Ash Wednesday, and when it is read, sustain me with a willing spirit, what does that mean? What image do you take away from it? And I'll tell you what the Hebrew says in a moment. But because we will hear this in English, any ideas? I'm saying to you, create in me a clean heart, O God, and a right spirit within me, and sustain me with a willing spirit. And this is why this is important sometimes for us to explore these texts. The word that is used there literally means generous. Generous. Sustain me with a generous spirit. Let my spirit, let the breath that I take, let the wind that comes out of me, let the very thing that makes me live. Remember, in Genesis, it is when God did what? It is when God breathed into the human being that the human became human. Let that very thing that makes me human, ruach, let that very thing that makes me human be a generous one.
And why is it translated willing? Because willing makes it sound like it could be the spirit of being willing to do your will, or like do the right thing, but generous is very different from willing.
It's very different, as in fact is steadfast from right.
Yeah.
Okay? And here's what you'll find. And this is not to give you a no answer for an answer, but here's what you will find. Okay? Look at, let me preface this. Let me qualify this, excuse me. Look at legitimate English translations, right? Whether it's the New English Bible or the Catholic Bible or the Jewish Bible translation or the New Revised Standard Version or the Jerusalem Bible, and you will find what? You'll have a range of words, right? Depending what the emphasis is. By the way, don't look at the Living Bible. No, I mean, it's not a translation. It's a paraphrase that takes you all over the place. And the fact that something is easy does not make it right, as you well know, right? Okay. But if we take this seriously, as I believe we do, then we will find that, in fact, it has to do maybe with what particular trajectory the translators are wanting to emphasize and going. But here, we can take generous to mean what? As I will emphasize in a second. To give, right? It could be monetary. So one could argue it has an economic overtone to it. Be generous, but it could be with ourselves, with our time, with our care, with our compassion. Be generous of who we are. I sometimes use this word with faculty. I do. And I remind them, as I did in our opening convocation, that because we have all of the credentials that we have, which is the baseline for why you're here, does not make us great teachers. So let's explore what would make us great teachers. And by the way, forget about the titles. That's why we're here, to teach. And some of the qualities that we're talking about are exactly the qualities that we want to be infused into our teaching. To be generous with our time, to be caring, to be compassionate, to be thoughtful. It's not easy, but it's what will set us apart. And then it says, deliver me from bloodsheds, O God, bloodshed. And the Hebrew there is plural. Deliver me from bloodshed, except the Hebrew is plural. And maybe it's an invitation that reminds us that maybe bloodshed comes in different forms. When Cain killed Abel, okay, even the stones, right, will cry out from the blood, and the Hebrew there is plural as well. What we do to each other. What we do to each other. And here is both positive and a challenge. Be generous and save me, O God, from the bloodsheds that surround us. I don't have to tell you what that means. We know. Look around. And the sacrifice that I want is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart that you will not despise. And then quickly, and I feel like we are seeing Europe in 24 hours here, but the Matthew text that begins, beware of practicing your piety before others. Okay? Don't show people how holy you are. By the way, you want to show folks how holy you are? Knock yourself out. And while you're at it, tell them that you're fasting at the same time. Okay? Kind of. Just double up, right? Beware of practicing your piety in public so people could say, that's really one holy person there. You know?
You find it ironic that's an Ashes Day first. People take ashes and practice their piety
In public.
And I think that I find an irony there.
Yes, there is. And one of my colleagues, by the way, who is, I should say, absolutely a wonderful colleague and even a better person, I believe, okay, comes clearly in the morning and throughout the day has ashes on his forehead. Okay? I remember one of the Vikings general manager, who, the Minnesota Vikings, by the way, the only Vikings that really matter, okay, in case you, would have ashes on his forehead as he's speaking to the press and that sort of thing. But it's ironic, right? Because it identifies you. But maybe it identifies you, Jeff, not to get away from this, as dust, because that's what it is. Now, the world might not see it that way. The world might say, well, this is a public display, right? But the acknowledgement that you may be dust. And I hope that in the deepest essence of that, it's what it is. So it says, when you give alms, do not sound the trumpet. By the way, when you're giving alms, don't let the whole world know, excuse me while I take out my checkbook and write, okay? While you're doing that, be sure that you tell them that you're fasting as well, okay? But when you give alms, do not sound the trumpet before you as the hypocrites do. Okay? By the way, hypocrites, do we know any hypocrites? Yeah. It's wonderful to live in a society of such pureness. The Greek word hypokritos means, of all things, actor. Actor. We get the word hypocrite from that. If you want to show off and you want to act in front, okay, that's what a hypocrite is. It means that this is not who you are. And the world will know that it's not who you are. And if you want to do that, again, knock yourself out. Okay, but what I want to emphasize here is this. It presupposes that you and I give alms. It says when you give alms, not if. Not if. And the word that is used here, the assumption that is used, it really has to do with, again, the word in Hebrew that means righteous. That's what almsgiving is. It is to express righteousness. When you express righteousness, right, don't do it in public. Don't let the world necessarily know. Maybe it's not always easy to do that. Okay. One final thing here. The Greek word that is used here for alms, eleos, okay, is the word that means mercy. I'll leave you with this. Almsgiving is to show mercy. Almsgiving is to show righteousness. Almsgiving is not to show a public display of how much. It is to show righteousness and mercy. And that is what the Hebrew and the Greek say. Okay? And by the way, obviously we know, not only within Christianity, but in Judaism and in Islam, the three monotheistic religions. In Islam, alms is what? It's one of the 5 pillars. Okay? It's one of the 5 pillars. It's in Judaism and it is in Christianity. And so it should not be negotiable. But so that we don't reduce it only to giving of a few pennies or whatever the case might be, it is to show mercy and to be righteous. And both of those things have to have a predicate. You can't say, I am merciful, and I'm saying, could you say more? And you're saying, no. That's it. It has to have a predicate. You can't simply say, I'm righteous, but where does your righteousness go or show? You can't say, well, there is no predicate. Which means that ultimately it's relational. All right. So I was going to also do the first Sunday of Lent, which of course we're not going to be doing because we don't have any more time today. But we have Ash Wednesday, and continuing next Sunday throughout Lent, we'll be exploring these texts, looking at some of the background and the meaning. So thanks, everyone.